Thank you, Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise today to talk about the Electoral Prisoners Voting Amendment Bill 2018 and want to signify my wholehearted support for this bill, which I see as common sense, and it's good to see the new government exhibiting some common sense after a long wait to see any from the previous government. This bill will bring South Australia in line with all other states in Australia, with the sole exception of the Australian Capital Territory in this specific area of law. This bill will ensure that prisoners serving more than 3 years in jail forfeit their right to vote, such has been the seriousness of the crime for which they have been found guilty. And a sentence, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, of 3 years or more incarceration does, to me, indicate sufficient seriousness, in my opinion. It does not mean that they will be not eligible to vote upon their release, which is also an important point and an important part of this bill. This bill ensures that the person's right to vote is not removed forevermore, only whilst they are incarcerated for the 3 years or more, and that the bill does not affect a person's enrolment status or their ability to enrol, which is another important point. I believe this bill is in line with society's belief that once a person has served his jail time, paid for his crime if you will, he has every right to rejoin society and get on with his or her life. Jail is not, after all, not singularly a punitive measure, but also a rehabilitative measure as well, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, and this Marshall Liberal government is not proposing to punish the detainee after they have served their time and been rehabilitated. It is a privilege to vote in this country, and this bill reflects the importance of that point. It is a privilege to vote in our democratic society, and we have fought for and to retain this right for years and years, over centuries and centuries. It is a constitutionally enshrined right to vote, and everyone should have the ability to cast their vote. When being found guilty of a serious crime, one carrying a sentence of more than 3 years, one should expect to forfeit that right, in my honest opinion, Mr Deputy Speaker. There has to be deterrence toward committing crimes of sufficient impact to warrant in excess of 3 years incarceration, and I would suggest to you, Mr Deputy Speaker, that losing your right to vote is as powerful a deterrent as there is. I am sure many South Australians would join me in relishing the right to vote and always appreciating the opportunity that we have here in Australia and in South Australia. In other countries around the world, and particularly some of the socialist ones you find around the globe, they have their right to vote tampered with and often removed in total. We are lucky that we enjoy the freedom to vote here, and we acknowledge that not every country has that same freedom. I'm sure that every South Australian enjoys that privilege like I do, and I'm certain with the passage of this legislation there will be would-be criminals who appreciate their right to vote and enjoy their right to vote, who are now reconsidering their inclination to commit such an offence. I mean that with all sincerity, Mr Deputy Speaker. That is the base belief behind this bill, and I agree wholeheartedly with it. The bill also fulfils another Marshall government's pre-election commitment to prevent prisoners who are serving a 3-year imprisonment or longer from voting in South Australian elections, and I am a staunch supporter of delivering on all promises made during the election campaign, which provides me with an opportune time, Mr Deputy Speaker, to touch on the other commitments made by the Liberal government in the electorate of Narungga throughout the election campaign. I'm looking forward to delivering increased funding for our regional roads and better health services and lower costs of living and doing business.
Yes, point of order.
Relevance. This has nothing to do with the bill.
Look, I uphold that point of order. So I ask for the member for Narungga to at least bring his comments back close to what the bill is.
I digress, Mr Speaker. I've made the point. I'm quite content with that. I'll continue on the topic at hand. I will continue the topic at hand. I reiterate that after release, prisoners will be able to vote again, which is consistent with the principle that punishment should not extend beyond the original sentence. Once a detainee has served their time and has proved they are rehabilitated, they should be free to leave the prison and rejoin the community. Others, like Colin Humphries, who cannot prove they are rehabilitated and should not be free to leave in jail and should be there to continue the rehabilitation. Thankfully, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I know that mums and dads around the state are thankful, this Marshall Liberal government has ensured that Mr Humphries and his kind are not free to leave the jail by passing legislation through the lower house recently. A wonderful initiative from the Marshall Liberal government and the Attorney-General in that regard. But back to the legislation at hand with the Electoral Prisoner Voting Amendment Bill, and this legislation will ensure the basic right for an Australian to vote, a right that people of all nationalities don't necessarily enjoy once they leave prison. I would like to really enforce that this government does not intend to take away the voting rights of prisoners indefinitely, only for the period of their incarceration. Once they have rehabilitated, they should be free to go and enjoy the rights and freedoms, with some obvious exceptions of normal community members. It's interesting to note that this bill should have been in effect at April 2018, would have changed the voting rights for an estimated 1,400 people. So this is not an insignificant change to make and impacts a great deal many people. And it is not lightly moved, as it is everyone's fundamental democratic right to vote once they turn 18, a rite of passage if you like. But it must also be understood that committing an offence that attracts a prison term of 3 years or longer is and should be so serious that the consequences ought to go beyond imprisonment to forfeiting their rights to vote for the duration of their sentence. Mr Deputy Speaker, there is not a prison within the electorate of Narungga, but there is interest from some sectors in having one. Last June, the Wakefield Regional Council CEO Jason Kukul publicly called for the government to consider building one within the Narungga electorate in the Port Wakefield Balaclava district, and it was included in the Wakefield Regional Council's strategic management plan as a key economic generator. The headline in the Plains Producer, a great weekly newspaper out there in Balaclava, which is printed in Kadina, Mr Deputy Speaker, was at the time Prison Vision, and the story outlined the CEO's discussions with the then Corrections Minister Peter Malinauskas regarding a prison proposal. The CEO, Jason Kukul, believed a jail was something that a realistic proposal, and one that would ease perceived pressure on the state to develop a new jail to meet the unfortunate future demand. As an aside, the point was made that if not for the issues around power and energy supply that had dominated public policy development and discussions in this place since the blackout of 2016, such a proposal and work towards the development of a new prison for the state would have possibly been well more advanced. Yes, there have been many consequences of the power blackout, and it has impacted on progress in many areas, on many proposals, on many visions for progress across multiple portfolios. Another story for another day, perhaps. I don't want to get called up for relevance again, Mr Deputy Speaker. There is recognised stresses on our state's penitentiary system and demand for more beds in all prisons in order to meet, sadly, projected demand. Mr Kukul's point was that the Wakefield Regional Council area would be ideal for such a facility is a valid one, and one that I agree with in principle. Given its proximity to the city and the little potential social impact on a new prison that would have in the relatively sparsely populated area. Indeed, regions within 2 hours of Adelaide, such as Murray Bridge, which is already home to a prison which we have heard about already this morning, are ideal for such facilities as they serve as major employers for the rural areas and good drivers of infrastructure development. Modern-day jails are generally set apart from the townships, and there is hundreds of jobs associated with them, as stated by Mr Kukul at the time, and I'm quoting from the local press. The initial build alone is several $100 million. Then there's the ongoing maintenance, uniforms and linen that needs cleaning. Mr Kukul cited a Canadian town, Grand Cache, which was experienced economic issues before its state government built a jail nearby. I quote again from the Plains Producer in an article written by editor Les Pearson. It was a coal mining town similar in size to Balaclava that was suffering due to fluctuating commodity prices. The Alberta government built a jail there, and it stabilised the local population and economy. The jail was not the only major economic option on the Wakefield Regional Council's wish list. The Plains Producer also highlighted with a zoo featuring in the council's strategic management plan as well, Mr Deputy Speaker, interestingly enough. Mr Kukul was making the point that rather than stipulating to developers this is what should happen, it's saying we are open to a variety of large-scale options for the good of the region, which is commendable and responsible forward planning. I believe the Wakefield Regional Council was onto something when it included a prison vision for its region, and with Port Wakefield just an hour easy drive from the city, I agree with it would be a reasonable location for servicing the facility and an easy commute for relatives looking to visit inmates. But back to the bill at hand one more time, Mr Deputy Speaker. South Australia is currently the only state, with the exception of the ACT, that does not impose restrictions upon prisoners voting. And it goes against my principles of justice that this should not be so. I sincerely look forward to the passage of this bill and look forward to hearing from all the other members as to their views on it. I implore those other members in this House to offer similar support for the amendments to Section 68 of the Electoral Act. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Before I call the next speaker, I will acknowledge in the gallery the former member for Playford in the House of Assembly and former Senator for South Australia, Mr John Quirk. Welcome. Yeah, thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise also to make a contribution to this bill and to say wholeheartedly that I support this Electoral Prisoner Voting Amendment Bill 2018 and to outline very quickly, as others have done, that essentially where somebody commits an offence that attracts a prison term of 3 years or longer, their voting rights should be forfeited, and that